Eleanor Voss Rain stood at the edge of the ballroom with a glass of wine going warm in her hand, and she did not scream. She did not weep. She did not look away from the sight of her husband fastening a garnet bracelet around Lady Seraphina Vale's wrist, while 40 of the county's best families watched and pretended not to. Her fingers found the ribbon at her throat, found the small, hard shape of the ring beneath her collar, and pressed it flat once, the way a woman counts a coin she means to spend carefully. She set the wineglass down on the nearest table with both hands, so it would not shake, so it would not ring against the wood and give her away. By morning, the house would know exactly what an invisible woman could build with a pen, a ledger, and the whole of a summer, because by morning she would be gone, and it would take her husband the better part of a year to understand what he had just called suitable. If a story like this one has ever felt like your own, the quiet parts of you that go unseen, the love that gets called usefulness instead, take a moment now and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss where this one goes. The summer of 1819 had come to Cardenshire the way it always did, heavy and green and indifferent to the households wilting beneath it, and it found Kestwick Hall precisely as it had found it every summer for 2 years, orderly, solvent, and quietly running on the labour of a woman nobody thanked. Eleanor had married Julian Rain, Duke of Kestwick, in the cold February after his father's death, in a ceremony arranged with the brisk efficiency of a land transfer. She had brought a small dowry, an excellent hand for figures, and a name that meant nothing in London and very little in the county. He had brought a title, 11,000 acres, and a coldness so total that the servants had taken to calling it, privately, the weather. She had not expected love. She had been raised by a father who taught her that expecting things you could not verify was how women ruined themselves, and Josiah Voss had not raised a fool. But she had expected, perhaps, to be seen, to have the ledgers she balanced at midnight, the tenants she visited in the rain, the roof she had argued the estate carpenter into, repairing before the frost came, counted for something more than upkeep. Instead, she had become what a well-run house becomes to the man who owns it, invisible, because it never went wrong. Julian noticed weather. He noticed crop yields and horse lameness, and the exact moment his steward's reports began to run a week ahead of the old pace. He did not notice that his wife had authored the improvement. He signed what she prepared, thanked her in the manner one thanks a competent solicitor, and returned to London for the parliamentary session, where he stayed longer each year and wrote shorter letters, and eventually stopped writing them at all in favour of instructions relayed through his cousin. That cousin was Lady Seraphina Vale, 29, recently widowed, and possessed of the particular warmth that made rooms feel colder once she had left them. She had arrived at Kestwick in the spring on the pretext of a long visit, and had not, in 4 months, once offered to leave. She was smooth as poured cream in company, and precise as a surveyor's line, when alone with Julian, and by June she had made herself so thoroughly necessary to his correspondence, his calendar, and his evenings, that Eleanor had begun keeping a private ledger of a different kind, not sums, this time, but dates. The 14th of June, Seraphina rode with him to the mill. The 2nd of July, she sat at the foot of the table where Eleanor's chair should have been, because Eleanor had been delayed at the tenant cottages, and no one had thought to wait. Eleanor's father had died 4 years before the wedding, of a lung fever that took him in a single hard winter, leaving her a small crumbling property called Thistledown at the edge of the village of Millbrook, a modest sum of money, and a habit of writing things down. "Write it down, Eleanor," he used to say, tapping the ledger with one ink-stained finger. Feelings lie. Numbers do not. She had loved him with the whole unguarded force a girl gives her only parent, and she had buried that love, when he died, in the bottom drawer of her writing desk along with his last letters, and had allowed herself exactly 20 minutes of grief a day for the first year, and 10 the year after, because a woman who meant to survive could not afford to drown in what she'd lost. She had kept the habit into her marriage. She had a great many things filed away, by now, in that particular drawer. The harvest ball fell on the last Saturday of July, an old Kestwick tradition. The one night when the tenants and the gentry occupied the same rooms, however briefly, before the gentry retreated to their own parlour, and the tenants to the long tables in the tent on the lawn. Eleanor had organised it herself, as she organised everything, the menu, the musicians, the seating that kept old grudges apart and old friendships together. She had worn her mother's ring on its ribbon beneath her bodice, as she always did, because it did not fit her finger and never would, her mother's hands having been smaller than her own, and she had worn Julian's mother's garnet set on her actual hand, the ring that came with the title, the one that fit. She had gone looking for her husband at 9 o'clock, to remind him it was time to open the dancing, and she had found him instead in the small parlour off the hall, with the door not quite closed, fastening a bracelet, his mother's garnets, the matched set, the one Eleanor wore the ring from, around Seraphina Vale's wrist. "There," Julian said, "it suits you better than it ever suited anyone in this family." "You flatter me, cousin," Seraphina said, and her voice had the particular warmth of a woman who has just won something and intends to be gracious about it in front of a witness she has not yet noticed. "I don't flatter," Julian said. "I calculate. It's a family trait. Lady Ophelia Marsh, his aunt, standing near the window with her back half to the door, said something Eleanor didn't catch, and then, more clearly, 'And your wife, Julian? Does she know you're giving away her jewellery? It isn't hers, it's the family's. Eleanor understands the difference.' A pause. He turned the bracelet's clasp, checking it, the way he checked a ledger column. "She's suitable, Aunt. She runs the house better than my mother ever did. I never told her I loved her, because I don't, not the way you mean it, and I never pretended to. There was no deceit in it, only arrangement." "That is a cold word for a marriage," Lady Ophelia said. "It's an honest one," Julian said. "I'd rather be cold and honest than warm and false. My father taught me that much, if nothing else." Eleanor did not go in. She did not make a sound. She stood in the corridor with her hand at her throat, found the ring beneath the fabric, and pressed it flat once, and then she turned and walked back toward the ballroom with her spine as straight as a bricklayer's line, and she smiled at the first guest who caught her eye. And she opened the dancing on time, because a house that stopped running on the night its mistress learned her true value was a house that had let the wrong person win. She gave herself 20 minutes that night. Not more. She sat in her private sitting room at midnight, after the last carriage had gone, and she wept without sound into a folded handkerchief for exactly 20 minutes by the mantel clock, and then she stopped, and she blew her nose, and she opened her writing desk. She did not write him a letter of accusation. She wrote 3 lists. The first was an inventory of everything at Kestwick that was legally, unambiguously hers, her dowry, invested and untouched, the small annual sum her father had settled on her separately from the marriage articles, and thistledown which had never passed into the marriage settlement at all. An oversight of a rushed solicitor 2 years back that she had noted at the time and said nothing about, filing it away the way she filed everything. The second list was of what needed doing at Kestwick before she left it, so that the tenants would not suffer for her husband's arithmetic. The third list had one line on it, what she would require of any man before she called herself his again, should that day ever come. By 4 a.m, she had packed one trunk, left instructions with the housekeeper that would not raise alarm before noon, and taken the old gig and a steady horse out along the lane toward Millbrook, toward the crumbling roof and the overgrown garden of Thistledown, toward a life that was entirely, unmistakably, her own. She did not look back at the Hall. She had learned, from a man who had loved her without conditions and was 4 years dead, that looking back was a luxury for people who could afford to lose momentum. And she could not. Cousin Hester Combe, who farmed the neighbouring 100 acres and had known Eleanor's mother before either of them were married, found her at Thistledown's gate at 6:30, unloading the trunk herself because there was no one else to do it. "Well," Hester said, arms crossed, taking in the trunk, the horse, the dawn-grey face. "I'd say good morning, but it plainly isn't. For you." "It will be," Eleanor said. "Eventually, that's the spirit that gets a woman through a bad harvest, and not much else," Hester said. "What happened?" "He called me suitable," Eleanor said. "To his aunt, in a room he thought was closed." Hester was quiet a moment, the way a woman is quiet when she is deciding how much of her anger to show a person who has not yet decided to show any of her own. "Suitable," she repeated. "That's the word men use for a good horse." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I noticed the same thing. What are you going to do?" Eleanor looked past her, at the house, sagging roofline, weed-choked drive, chimneys that hadn't drawn properly in a decade, and something in her settled. The way a foundation settles once the weight is finally where it belongs. "I'm going to make this place impossible to overlook," she said, "and then I'm going to let the county watch him try to explain why he ever thought I was ordinary." Hester almost smiled. "You'll want breakfast first," she said. "Even revolutions eat." Thistledown had 11 acres, a house with 3 sound rooms and 4 that weren't. A tenant farmer named Old Larkin, working the land on a rack rent Eleanor's father had never gotten around to lowering, and exactly £41 in the strongbox her father had left her, minus what the journey and the first week's provisions would cost. It was not much. It was, Eleanor thought, running her hand along the dusty top of her mother's writing desk on her first morning, as its sole occupant, considerably more than nothing. And nothing had never stopped her before. She began with the roof, because a roof was arithmetic before it was anything else. So many slates, so many pounds, so many days of dry weather remaining in which to do the work. She rode to Marlstone, the county town, and sat across a desk from Mr. Sylvanus Crane, a solicitor with ink-stained cuffs and a reputation for taking no one's word over a document, and asked him 3 precise questions about the boundary between what belonged to her outright and what a husband might, in law, still claim. "Legally," Crane said, steepling his fingers, "Thistledown was never entered into your marriage settlement. An oversight evidently on someone's part." He did not smile quite, but something in his eyes suggested he found the oversight interesting rather than regrettable. "It is yours, Your Grace, free and entire, to manage as you see fit." "Don't call me that here," Eleanor said. "Here I'm Eleanor Voss, that's the name on the deed, and it's the name I intend to use." Old Larkin, when she told him she meant to lower his rent by 1/5 and split the difference with him on a new drainage ditch that would save his lower field from flooding every spring, looked at her the way a man looks at weather that has finally, unaccountably, turned in his favour. "Beggin' your pardon, missus," he said. "But why would you do that? Your father never did, not in 15 years. My father was a good man who never had time to finish his sums, Eleanor said. I have nothing but time, and a drained field pays better rent than a flooded one. Eventually, it's not charity, Mr. Larkin. It's arithmetic. I intend to do a great deal of arithmetic here. He agreed. He also, without her asking, sent his son Tom around the following Sunday to help with the roof, because word had already begun to move through Millbrook the way word moves through any small place, quietly and faster than anyone expects. She sold 2 pieces of jewellery that were unambiguously her own, not Kestwick's, to fund the slates and the ditch. She kept accounts in a new ledger, dated and initialled at the top of every page, the same discipline she had brought to Kestwick's books for 2 years without a single line of credit for it. Within 6 weeks the roof did not leak. Within 8 the ditch was dug, and Larkin's lower field, for the first time in memory, stayed dry through a hard rain. Within 10 she had let 2 of the 4 ruined rooms to a widow, and her 2 daughters who needed lodging and could pay in labour, mending, laundry, garden work, instead of coin. And Thistledown had, for the first time in a decade, the sound of more than one household moving through it. Julian did not come for 3 weeks. Eleanor had expected as much. A man who called his wife suitable in a closed room was not a man who checked on furniture. What she had not expected was the letter that arrived in the 4th week, in his hand, unsigned by any endearment, informing her that her absence had been noted, that it reflected poorly on the household, and that he trusted she would return before the quarter's accounts were due, as no one else understood the filing system. She wrote back 4 lines. I understand the filing system, because I built it. I am not returning to be found useful again. If you would like to speak with me, you may come to Thistledown, in Millbrook, where I live now under my own name, E. Voss. He did not come for another 2 weeks after that. When he finally did, it was on a grey afternoon in the 2nd week of September, and he came alone, without warning, and found his wife on her knees in the garden with dirt under her nails, directing Tom Larkin where to set a row of winter cabbages, and for a long moment he simply stood at the gate and watched her. The particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes. You're gardening, he said finally, as though it were an accusation. Eleanor did not look up. I'm feeding a household of 5 through the winter, she said. Gardening is what that looks like from a distance. The roof's been mended, he said. He had noticed it then on his way in. Of course he had. He noticed roofs. It leaked. I don't care for leaks. She sat back on her heels and finally looked at him, and something in her chest, not hope, she refused to call it hope, something smaller and more disciplined, noted that he looked tired in a way she hadn't seen on him before. Why are you here, Julian? The accounts are with your steward, who is perfectly capable, and who I trained myself, though you've never once said so. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirts, and did not offer him the courtesy of coming closer. Try again. He was quiet a long moment. Behind him, Tom Larkin found urgent business at the far end of the row. I don't know why I'm here, Julian said at last, and it cost him something to say it. She could hear the cost in the flatness of his voice, like a man reading a bill he could not afford. I told myself it was the accounts. It isn't the accounts. That's a start, Eleanor said. It's a small one. I'll take it. He stayed 20 minutes. He said almost nothing else of consequence. But he looked, before he left, at the mended roof, at the drained field beyond the hedge, at the cabbages in their exact rows, and something behind his eyes moved, the way weather moves before you can name what it's about to do, and Eleanor filed the visit away in the drawer with the rest, and went back to her work, because work did not wait on a man's slow arithmetic, however his eyes moved. Word of Thistledown's turning travelled through the county, that autumn the way gossip moves through farmland, downhill and gathering speed. By October, Eleanor was fielding 2 more lodgers than she had room for, and had begun, at Hester's blunt suggestion, teaching 3 of the village children their letters on Sunday afternoons, in the one room at Thistledown that had good light and a decent hearth. She paid old Larkin's boy Tom a fair wage, not a favour, for his labour, and made a point of saying so aloud in front of others, because a wage spoken plainly was a different thing from a wage assumed. Mrs. Pruitt, who kept the shop in Millbrook, began referring to her, without irony, as Mrs. Voss of Thistledown, as though the place and the woman had become a single fact. Julian came again in October, and this time he stayed an hour, and asked, stiffly, whether she required funds. She told him she did not, and watched something in his face that might, in a warmer man, have been disappointment. It was on his 3rd visit, in the first cold week of November, that he told her about his mother. They were in the one good parlour, a small fire going, a pot of tea between them that Eleanor had poured, because it would have been strange not to. And Julian sat with his hat in his hands, turning it, the way a man turns something when he cannot make himself sit still and cannot make himself leave. My mother left when I was 10, he said, to the hat, not to her. Not by choice. My father decided she was unsuitable. That was his word. Unsuitable, I remember it exactly, because she'd borne no second son, and because she'd been seen laughing too freely with the curate at a dinner. Which was nothing, which was entirely nothing, but my father needed a reason, and that was the reason he chose. He sent her to a house in Bath with an allowance and a letter forbidding correspondence, and he told me, that same week, that love was a debt a wise man never opened an account for, because debts get called. Eleanor said nothing. She had learned from years of ledgers that silence was often the fastest way to the truth of a column. I believed him, Julian said. I've spent 20 years believing him. I married you because you were competent and unlikely to embarrass me, and because I had convinced myself that wanting more than that was the mistake that cost my mother her home. I called you suitable, because suitable was the highest praise I trusted myself to give anyone, ever, without opening the account. He looked up at last. It was not an excuse. I know it isn't one. I'm not offering it as one. Good, Eleanor said, because I wasn't going to accept it as one. She set down her cup. I'm sorry for the boy who watched that happen to his mother. I mean that. But I am not going to spend my life paying the interest on your father's cruelty, Julian. That debt isn't mine. No, he said. It isn't. He turned the hat once more. I don't entirely know how to stop being the man he made. I've started to notice that I don't know, which I understand is not the same as knowing how to fix it. It's a start, Eleanor said again, because it was, and because she had promised herself she would give credit where the numbers, however small, warranted it. She did not invite him to stay for dinner. He did not ask, but at the gate, before he mounted, he paused and said, without turning around, the garnets. I gave them to Seraphina because they were never yours to begin with, my mother's set, entailed to whoever holds the courtesy title of the next Duchess apparent, not to you personally, and I told myself the distinction mattered. It didn't matter. I understand now that it didn't matter at all, and I am sorry. It was the first time he had said the word sorry to her, in 2 years of marriage, about anything. That's an apology, Eleanor said. It isn't yet an explanation for why you thought I would forgive watching you fasten them onto another woman's wrist in a room full of my neighbours. Those are different things. I'll want both, eventually, if we're to speak of anything further. He nodded slowly, as though filing the distinction away the way she filed hers, and rode back toward Kestwick, and Eleanor stood at the gate a long moment after he'd gone, her hand at her throat, the ring beneath her collar pressed flat, once, for the coin it had always been. Lady Seraphina Vale did not take Julian's cooling interest gracefully. She had spent 4 months positioning herself as the second Duchess of Kestwick in waiting, and a husband who rode out twice a month to sit in a crumbling cottage parlour with his supposedly discarded wife was not a husband whose fortune was following her plan. She began, quietly, to move paper. It started with a whisper at a milestone assembly, dropped in the hearing of exactly the right 2 matrons, that the late Josiah Voss had died substantially in debt. To the Vale family, as it happened, an old loan secured informally against Thistledown itself, never properly discharged. It was the sort of rumour that did real work. If Eleanor's father had died owing money against the very land she now farmed, then her right to it, and by extension the honesty of the small independent fortune she'd brought into her marriage, came into serious question. And a marriage contracted on a misrepresented settlement was a marriage a determined solicitor could, under the right pressure, begin to unravel. Eleanor heard of it from Hester, who heard it from the miller's wife, who heard it from one of the matrons directly. Within 4 days, gossip in Cardenshire moved, as ever, the way water moves downhill, and it had reached Thistledown before it had properly finished making the rounds of Marston. "It's a lie," Eleanor said, when Hester laid it out over the kitchen table. "My father never borrowed from the Vales. I kept his books myself the last 2 years of his life. I would know. I believe you," Hester said. "The county might not." Lies with a lady's name behind them travel faster than plain truth, and you know it. Eleanor sat with that a moment, then rose and went to her mother's writing desk, the one piece of furniture she had refused to sell even in the leanest weeks, and drew out the small brass key she kept on her own ribbon, beside the ring, and opened the bottom drawer where her father's letters and papers had rested undisturbed since his death. She had never gone through all of it. Grief, rationed as she kept it, had never stretched far enough to cover a full accounting of a dead man's correspondence. She found it on the second evening of searching, by candlelight, Hester at her elbow, a discharge receipt, dated 11 years back, in her father's careful hand, and countersigned by the elder Mr. Vale. Seraphina's late father-in-law, acknowledging that a small loan of £30. 30. Not the hundreds the rumour now claimed, had been repaid in full, with the note itself surrendered and destroyed. Josiah Voss, tidy to the end, had kept the receipt anyway, because he had never in his life trusted anyone's memory over a document. "There," Eleanor said, laying it flat on the table, smoothing it with 2 fingers. "There's no debt. There never was one, which means whatever Seraphina is telling the county is either a lie built from nothing, or she's got a paper of her own," Hester finished, "and it's a forged one." Eleanor went to Marston the next morning and put the receipt in Sylvanus Crane's hands. "Keep it locked," she told him, "and find out, quietly, whether anyone has lodged a note or a claim against Thistledown at the county registry recently." I have a suspicion someone means to manufacture what my father never signed. Crane, to his credit, did not ask why a woman living in a half-repaired cottage was suddenly speaking like a barrister. He simply nodded and said he would write within the week. He wrote within 4 days, and what he found confirmed the shape of it. A note, purporting to bear Josiah Voss's signature, acknowledging a debt of £200 to the Vale estate, lodged at the registry not 11 years ago, but a mere 6 weeks past, backdated, badly, by someone in a hurry. Crane, comparing it against 3 of Voss's genuine signed letters that Eleanor supplied, pointed out with evident satisfaction that the forger had gotten the flourish on the J wrong in a way no man forges his own hand wrong, and that the ink, tested against the paper's claimed age, was far too fresh. "It's clumsy," Crane said. "Whoever did this expected no one would look closely. They expected a grieving daughter and a distracted duke, not a magistrate's eye. They expected me to still be invisible," Eleanor said. "That's their whole error. I've stopped being invisible." She did not go to Julian with it immediately. She let the county keep talking a while longer, let Seraphina's whispers ripen into open confidence, because a liar who believes she has already won is a liar who stops being careful, and Eleanor had learned, from years of watching numbers, that the moment to strike a column was the moment it looked most secure. She spent the next fortnight quietly gathering more. A statement from the elder Mr. Vale's former clerk, now retired and living in Marston, confirming the original £30 loan and its lawful discharge, a note from the registry clerk who'd filed the backdated document, recalling, once pressed gently by Crane, that the lady who'd brought it in had been in a visible hurry and had not stayed to answer the customary questions. The county's annual harvest assembly, the formal gathering that followed the tenants' harvest ball by 6 weeks, held in the Marsden Assembly Rooms and attended by every family of consequence in Cardenshire, along with the tenant representatives who came to receive the season's public accounting, fell in the 3rd week of November. It was, Eleanor knew, precisely the room in which a rumour like Seraphina's would either be sealed as fact or broken as fiction, because it was the one room every relevant witness could be gathered into at once, without appearing to have been summoned. She wrote to Julian 3 days before it, not a plea, an instruction. "I have proof that the debt against my father, and by extension against Thistledown, is a fabrication, and I know who fabricated it, and why. I intend to make that proof public at the assembly on Thursday, with or without your presence. Given that your name and mine remain, whatever else stands between us, legally joined, I thought you should have the choice of standing beside that proof, rather than reading of it afterward in a letter. E. Voss." He came. He arrived at the assembly rooms early, found her in the anteroom where the tenant representatives waited to be called in for the accounting, and said, "Without preamble, show me what you have." She showed him. She watched his face as he read the forged note beside the true discharge receipt, watched the particular stillness that came over him when the flourish on the false J caught his eye. He had, after all, spent 2 years reading his own family's ledgers, and a wrong flourish was the kind of error a careful man's eye snagged on the way a nail snags wool. "She's been staying in my house," Julian said quietly. "Managing my correspondence. For 4 months. "Yes," Eleanor said, "I let her." "Yes," Eleanor said. "You did. That's not an accusation, Julian, it's simply the shape of what happened. We can discuss whose blindness allowed it another time. Right now I need to know whether you intend to stand beside me when I lay this in front of the county, or whether you intend to sit with your aunt and watch." He looked at her for a long moment, in the grey light of the anteroom, and something in his jaw set, the way a man's jaw sets when he has finally decided which side of a ledger he means to stand on. "I'll stand beside you," he said. "It's the least of what I owe you. It is nowhere near all of it." The assembly rooms were full by the time the formal business began, the county magistrate presiding, the tenant representatives seated at the front by long custom, Lady Seraphina Vele near the head table in deep green silk, entirely at her ease, and Lady Ophelia Marsh beside her, and 40 families of Cardenshire filling the rest of the hall, the way water fills a low field. Eleanor stood when the magistrate, prompted by a note Crane had quietly delivered that morning, called for any matter of county record requiring public clarification before the harvest accounts were read. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, long ago, that a raised voice invited a room to doubt you, while a level one invited a room to lean in. "There has been a rumour circulating this county for some 6 weeks," she said, "concerning a debt my late father, Josiah Voss, is said to have owed the Vale family, secured against my property at Thistledown. I would like the county to have the truth of it, since the county has so generously been given the falsehood." She laid the discharge receipt on the table before the magistrate, and beside it the backdated forgery Crane had obtained from the registry. "This first document is my father's genuine hand, dated 11 years past, discharging a loan of £30 in full, countersigned by the elder Mr. Vale himself. This second document, claiming a debt of £200, was lodged at the Milestone Registry a mere 6 weeks ago, backdated to appear 11 years old. Mr. Crane will confirm the ink is fresh where the paper is not, and that the signature does not match my father's hand in the single detail a forger most commonly gets wrong." Crane rose and confirmed it, in the flat, precise language of a man who dealt in nothing but what could be proven. The registry clerk, seated near the back at Crane's earlier request, confirmed, red-faced, that the lady who had lodged the document 6 weeks prior had been in a considerable hurry and had declined to answer his questions about its provenance. "I would not presume to name who lodged it," Eleanor said, "except that I understand Lady Seraphina Vale visited the Milestone Registry on the 14th of October, a date the clerk's own book will confirm, on an errand she described at the time as private. The room's turning was audible before it was visible, a low collective breath, chairs shifting, Lady Ophelia's fan going suddenly still in her hand. Seraphina's composure, which had carried her through 4 months of borrowed warmth, did not crack all at once. It went the way ice goes on a pond that has been walked too many times. A long silence, and then, all at once, entirely, "This is absurd," Seraphina said too quickly, into a room that had gone very quiet to hear her say it. "I have no notion what the woman is implying. I am not implying," Eleanor said. "I am reading dates aloud. The clerk's book will do the implying for me, if the magistrate cares to examine it." She did not look at Seraphina with triumph. She looked at her the way a woman looks at a column that finally balances. "I don't say this to ruin you, Lady Seraphina. I say it because my father's name has been made to carry a debt he discharged 11 years ago, in good faith, to your husband's own father, and I will not have a dead man slandered to clear a path for a living woman's ambitions. It was old Larkin who stood next, unbidden, hat in his weathered hands, and asked to be heard, and the magistrate, startled, allowed it. 'I farmed under Vossland near on 20 year,' he said. And I'll say this plain. Josiah Voss never owed a soul a shilling he didn't pay, and his daughters lowered my rent and dug my ditch and paid my boy a fair wage for honest work, all since she come back to Thistledown alone. If the county wants to know what kind of woman she is, ask them as work for her, not them as gossip about her. A murmur of agreement moved through the tenant rows, quiet and solid. The sound of people who had nothing to gain from lying about a fair wage, and everything to lose from staying silent about an unfair one. Lady Seraphina Vale did not wait for the magistrate's ruling. She rose, very pale beneath her composure, and said, in a voice gone thin, "I believe I require air," and left the assembly rooms with as much dignity as the moment allowed her, which was not a great deal, and Lady Ophelia Marsh sat very still beside the empty chair, her fan finally moving again, slowly, like a woman recalculating an old sum. Julian, standing beside Eleanor through the whole of it, had not spoken a word. When the room's attention finally shifted from Seraphina's exit back to the head table, he took a single step forward. "I want the county to hear one more thing," he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried in the way a duke's voice carries when a room has already decided to listen to him. "My wife has managed the whole of Kestwick's accounts for 2 years, without my thanks, and largely without my notice, while I was in London deciding that competence was a lesser virtue than I now understand it to be. Whatever the county has heard of her these past months, understand that I am the last person in this room who deserves credit for any of it, and the first who ought to have known it all along." He did not look for applause. He got, instead, a silence that felt, Eleanor thought, oddly like the room recalibrating its whole ledger of him, not forgiveness, not yet, but the first entry in a column that had until now shown nothing but debt. They did not speak on the ride back to Thistledown, not properly, not until they stood again at the gate in the last grey light of the afternoon, the way they had stood there in September when he'd first come to find her gardening. "I owe you an explanation," Julian said. "Not the one I gave my aunt 6 months ago. The true one." "I know," Eleanor said. "I've been waiting for it." "An apology is a feeling, Julian. It costs a moment, and it's done. An explanation costs the truth, in full, and I find I require both before I decide anything further." He told her then, standing at the gate with the light going, the whole of it, that he had watched his father discard his mother for the crime of being loved too visibly, and had built, over 20 years, a fortress out of the lesson, brick by careful brick, until the fortress had a name, and the name was suitable, and he had married inside it, believing the walls would hold. That Seraphina's warmth had frightened him precisely because it asked nothing of him, and confirmed the fortress worked, while Eleanor's competence had frightened him more, because competence noticed things, and a woman who noticed things might eventually notice him, and a man noticed was a man exposed. And exposure was the one arithmetic his father had taught him never to risk. "I let her stay because she made no demands," he said. "I let you go because I told myself you needed nothing from me, and it was easier to believe that than to ask what you did need, in case the answer required something I didn't know how to give. What I needed," Eleanor said, "was to be seen doing the work I was already doing. That's all. It was never a large thing, Julian. It only felt large to you because you'd trained yourself for 20 years to treat every act of being seen as a debt about to be called." "Yes," he said. "I understand that now. I don't know yet how to stop expecting the bill." "Then we'll find out together," Eleanor said, "or we won't find out at all. But I'll tell you plainly what I require, since you've had my explanation and I mean to have my terms in return." She counted them on her fingers, the way her father had taught her to count anything that mattered. "My authority over Kestwick's household and its accounts, in writing, not by custom that can be revoked on a whim, my own name used and credited when the work is mine. No further arrangements made about tenants, staff, or family without my voice in the room. And you will apologise to Lady Ophelia yourself, properly, for the years you let your father's cruelty stand in as your whole philosophy of love, because she watched it happen to your mother and then watched you become the son of it, and she deserves better than silence on the subject. All right, Julian said. All right, then, Eleanor said, and something in the flatness of the exchange was, between the two of them, very nearly a treaty. He apologised to Lady Ophelia the following week, in a scene Eleanor did not witness, but heard of afterward from Hester, who had heard it from the housekeeper, who had heard it, this time, honestly from Lady Ophelia herself, moved enough by it to mention it unprompted at tea. He had gone to her sitting-room, sat without being asked, and said he was sorry, not for the bracelet, not for the assembly, but for 20 years of watching his father's cruelty toward his mother, and choosing, every year after, to defend it rather than name it for what it was, because naming it would have meant admitting what it had cost him too. Lady Ophelia had wept, apparently, which was more than Eleanor had ever managed to hear of the woman doing, and had told him it was the first true thing he'd said to her since he was 10 years old. What followed was not a single grand reversal, but a slow accumulation of ordinary days, and Eleanor, watching it happen, understood that this was precisely how it was supposed to work. Nothing in isolation, everything in sum. Julian rode to Thistledown twice a week through the winter, then 3 times, and began, without being asked, moving his chair to sit beside hers rather than across from her, when they went over the estate's books together, close enough that their sleeves sometimes touched over the ledger. He poured her tea before she reached for the pot herself, a small thing, an unremarkable thing, except that he had never once done it in 2 years of marriage, and Eleanor noted it in her private ledger of dates the way she noted everything that mattered. In February, a full year after their wedding, he had the Kestwick land agent draft new terms for every tenant on the estate, matching the fare. Itemised wages Eleanor had instituted at Thistledown, and he had the terms posted publicly at the estate office rather than delivered privately, because Eleanor had told him once that speeches cost nothing, and posted terms cost everything, and a man who wanted to be believed had better start paying in roofs, not words. There was one slip, in March, that Eleanor watched carefully, because she had learned that the true test of a changed man was not the grand gesture, but what he did when no one was managing him. Old Larkin's cottage roof needed replacing before spring planting, and Julian, informed of it by his steward, simply ordered the work done and the cost logged, the way his father would have, without consulting Eleanor at all, though the tenant agreements were now, by their own terms, jointly overseen. "You didn't ask me," Eleanor said, when she found the entry in the ledger. Julian looked. For a moment, as though he might defend it, it was a good decision after all, a necessary one, done promptly and fairly. And then he stopped himself, visibly, the way a man stops his own hand halfway to an old habit. "I did it the way my father would have done it," he said slowly. "Efficiently alone, without thinking that efficiency wasn't the thing you'd asked of me." "That's it exactly," Eleanor said. "It isn't that the decision was wrong. It's that you made it as though I weren't standing beside you, and I am tired of being managed well by men who forget I'm a person while they do it." "You're right," Julian said. "It won't happen again. I don't say that as a speech. I say it because I intend to prove it the slow way, the only way you've ever said you'd believe." He proved it, in the months that followed, by asking, every time, even when asking cost him time he didn't want to spend, even when the answer was simply yes, of course. Go ahead. The asking itself was the point. And eventually Eleanor stopped needing to note it in her ledger at all, because a thing that happens every time stops being a thing you have to track and starts being simply the shape of your life. He came to Thistledown on a warm evening in May, nearly a year to the week since she had left Kestwick in the grey dawn, with one trunk and a horse, and found her at the desk that had been her mother's, going over the accounts by lamplight, and he did not sit across from her. He stood behind her chair, close, and set his hand lightly on her shoulder, and Eleanor did not stiffen, which surprised her more than it surprised him. "I would ask you to come home," Julian said, "except I've learnt enough this year to know that Thistledown is your home now too, and Kestwick will have to earn the right to be spoken of the same way. So I won't ask you to come home. I'll ask you something smaller. Will you let me build a life here, with you, in whichever house we choose on whichever day, as long as you're the one choosing?" "That's better phrasing than I expected of you a year ago," Eleanor said, but her voice was not steady in quite the way it usually was, and he heard it and did not remark on it, which was itself a kind of tenderness she had not known to ask for. "I would choose you," Julian said. "I have been choosing you, quietly, for months now, in every ledger and every tenant's roof, and every time I stopped myself from doing what my father would have done instead of what you'd have wanted. I am only now saying it aloud, because I finally trust that saying it won't be the thing that ruins it." Eleanor set down her pen. She turned in the chair and reached up, and for the first time in over a year untied the ribbon at her throat with her own hands in front of him, and held the small worn ring out on her palm, her mother's ring, too small for her finger, kept close to her heart instead, because that was the only place it had ever properly fit. "This was hers," she said. "My mother's. It never fit me. I wore it anyway, because it reminded me what I was worth, even when no one in that house acted as though they knew." She closed her fingers around it, gently. "I'd like it sized properly now. Not to replace it with something grander, just sized, so I can wear it where it can be seen, the way I mean to be seen from now on." Julian took the ring from her palm with a care that would have surprised the man who had fastened another woman's bracelet a year before, and said, "I'll have it done myself, by hand, by the best jeweller in the county, and I will watch every measurement taken, because you have spent a year teaching me that the smallest things done properly are the only things that mean anything at all." It took 18 months, in the end, for the whole shape of the change to settle into something Eleanor trusted enough to stop counting. She and Julian divided their year between Kestwick and Thistledown, by her design, because a woman who had built a life with her own hands did not intend to abandon it for a grander house, merely because the grander house had finally learned to want her properly. The tenant wage terms, posted first at Thistledown and then across the whole of Kestwick, became simply how things were done in that corner of Cardenshire, copied within 2 years by 3 neighbouring estates, whose owners had watched the harvest yields on Voss and Kestwick land outpace their own, and drawn the obvious arithmetic conclusion. The room where Eleanor had once taught 3 village children their letters on Sunday afternoons became, by the second autumn, a proper school with a paid schoolmistress and 24 pupils, funded jointly and known, without any ceremony attached to the naming, as the Voss school, Julian's own suggestion, offered once and never repeated, because he had learned by then that some gestures needed to be made only once to mean everything. Lady Seraphina Veillet left Cardenshire within the month of the assembly, and did not return, Her fate, so far as the county ever learned it, was a quiet second marriage to a widowed merchant in the north, a life smaller than the one she had schemed for, and, by most accounts, no unhappier for it. Lady Ophelia Marsh became, in time, a regular presence at Thistledown's Sunday table, and it was Lady Ophelia, in the second spring, who told Eleanor, apropos of nothing, over tea, in the flat voice of a woman finally permitted her own opinions, that she had watched this family fail at love for 2 generations, and had never once until now seen anyone repair it rather than simply survive it. On a clear evening in the autumn of the second year, Eleanor stood in the doorway of Kestrick Hall's great hall, the one she had crossed 1,000 times as an unremarked wife, and now crossed as something else entirely, and felt for the first time she could name that the house itself seemed to exhale around her, the draughts gone from the east wing Julian had finally ordered repaired without. Being told, the fires kept generous rather than economical, the particular hush of a house that is no longer holding its breath, waiting to find out what its master will do next. She wore her mother's ring on her hand now, sized and settled and catching the last of the light, and it no longer meant what it had meant on the ribbon, not a secret kept close because the world outside could not be trusted with it, but a plain and open fact, worn the way a woman wears the truth once she has stopped needing to hide it. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself, instead, impossible to overlook, not through anger, and not through revenge, but through the slow, undeniable arithmetic of roofs mended, wages paid, ledgers balanced, and a life built so thoroughly on her own ground that the man who had once called her suitable was left with no honest word left to describe her, but extraordinary. Being needed had never been the same as being loved, and it had taken a duke the better part of 2 years to learn the difference, but he had learned it the only way the lesson ever truly holds, not through a speech, but through every ordinary day he showed up afterward and chose her again. And that, in the end, was the whole of the inheritance she meant to leave behind her. In a ledger, in a school, in a house finally breathing, not a fortune, and not a title, but the plain, permanent proof that a woman who refuses to disappear cannot, in the end, be made to. That's where I'll leave Eleanor and the county of Cardenshire tonight, with a house finally breathing, and a ring worn out in the open where it belongs. If her story struck something in you, that particular ache of being valued for what you do instead of who you are, subscribe to the channel so you're here for the next one. And I'd love to know, what would you have put on Eleanor's third list, the one about what she'd require before she called herself his again? Tell me in the comments. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.